We're here to discuss the emergence of music scenes, how they emerge, and the components of them. So I'd like to start by asking if what you think the components are that make up a scene.
You're in.
Well, I mean, you can. I think the thing about scenes, you can only really examine them when they're finished half the time. You know, when you're actually involved in something and it's successful, it just seems like a really good club that you're going to. And then 10 years later, you look back and you think, you know, that was a scene that I was involved in. Certainly with when I first moved to London in 1977, I moved down because I'd seen the Sex Pistols play at the Cleethorpes Winter Gardens, and I was inspired by that to move to London. But I mean, it didn't feel like a particularly earth-shattering thing generally, but when you look back at it now, it does seem like that. And it was the same with Acid House as well. It just seemed like, you know, really good parties and really good drugs for a while. But then when you look back at it, you think, wow, it was amazing. So often I think you kind of look at these things and they just seem like, you know, good times every weekend for a period. And then you look back and it seems a lot more significant on reflection. So it's not always that easy to recognise the fact that you're involved in something until it's actually over.
But would you think that the music was the key element to it, though? Or were there other things with attitude and things like that created the music almost?
I think it's, first of all, it's a very natural process. It's not something that's contrived, that you can just set up with a series of factors to, you know, create a scene. It's just something that naturally develops, whether it was, you know, white working class kids in the northwest, in Northern Soul in the mid-60s, whether it was house music throughout the UK. Again, in the mid to late 80s, what factors bring up? I think, obviously, music is absolutely fundamentally central, but I think the first thing, it's a very natural process. It starts off inevitably as a small hub of people who are just extremely passionate about what they do. And I think, you know, sometimes when you talk about the underground and the scene, it can come across as very pious and very holier than thou and very over serious, but in a sense the first and fundamental thing is an incredible passion for what you love and what you do, which sounds very obvious, but I think you look at house music, which I'm 44 now, Jesus, that's bad, and you know, in 84, 85 in Sheffield, house music, the early days of house music, like in Leeds and in Manchester, when you look, there was just such a small amount of people involved. You know, you're talking 200, 250, 300 people going to a small, shitty club, which are then slowly surely by osmosis, can I say osmosis?
You can say osmosis. Yes.
Develops into something, and I think that's the first thing, that you can't contrive that, and it's not a self-conscious thing. It just happens, and then it, you know, it snowballs. And if you think, you know, you take Sheffield. As I said, in 1985, there was probably 300 people involved in that early house scene, and then 20 years later, you have, you know, the likes of Gatecrash, huge clubs that have created an industry, you know, well and beyond that anyone could ever imagine. Whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, that's what it created. So I think a scene, it always starts with a small group of people, and there has to be a sense of belonging. There's an incredible documentary, if anyone gets a chance to see it, which is about Northern Soul and Manchester. The name, Bill, you'll know it, it comes to me, but it's quite incredible. These, you know, it's people who on Thursday night are saving every penny they've got to go out on Friday night to come back on Monday morning, and that's what they live for, is the music. And that's the fundamental thing. It can't be contrived or, you know, written about in a magazine before it has the chance to grow. Yeah, so I think that's the fundamental thing. Is sometimes the most cliched thing is the heart of it, really. It's just passionate people who aren't thinking too hard what they're doing.
What makes a scene? Well, I think young people, mainly, normally, isn't it? Often music, fashion, styling, then it's often quite rebellious. They want to be different, seen different from what their parents were doing, maybe even their older brothers and sisters. It is quite often what intoxicant people are using. Are they drinking? Or is it a type of drug that changes by different scenes? And I was thinking about this a little bit on the train on the way up. I mean, I don't know how sociological we're going to get about it, or you want to get about it, but I mean, we always look at scenes as subcultures, don't we? It's like youth subcultures, the famous ones, punk, we've mentioned already, house music, Northern Soul. But now I was thinking about it, I mean, a scene is a very natural thing, as Luke, you know, to use that cliched word again, said. It's like, I mean, for me, I was thinking, well, the scene's kind of, there's lots of different ones we don't think about, really. Isn't there that scene of kids in the dungeons and playing into Dungeons and Dragons in the adventure shop, that they all dress a certain way, they're all into the same thing. And then surely that's a little scene, isn't there? A scene of computer kids that are just hanging out in the computer room. Bill Gates was probably part of that scene. So I think we're a little bit wrong to think it just exclusively exists in this well popularised world of music and fashion. There's lots of little cliques, they call them in America, isn't there? And these are all scenes.
But surely I'd say that's more of a kind of tribe thing.
Yeah, but
and
isn't that what we're kind of starting to
have to relate to music?
Yeah.
I think scene is something that's more collective, that there's a kind of social.
But these are collectives, the collectors of people. But maybe people don't even care about that. I'm just answering the question as I saw it and thought about it a little bit on the coming up here today. But if we're talking about subcultures, music scenes, that's what we're interested in. Then those are strong factors, aren't they? Music, fashion, and styling, looking the part, being part, code, talking the same way. How are you talking? How do kids talk to each other in that scene? And what bands they identify with, and what they're doing. How they're going out and involving themselves in that scene.
But I think how does 200 people become 1,000 and then 3,000 and 10,000? I think that's to me a fundamental thing. How does that small embryo develop? And it's again, I've been thinking about this, and I think it really does vary. You look at punk, there's obviously loads and loads of factors by synchronicity that all come together at once, but there was a reaction against a very dominant mainstream, a reaction against progressive rock music, about so many things that came together. There has to be, circumstances around, where that scene is for it to allow it to grow. House music, there was 200 people, then it was 300, and then so many factors came into play, whereby, the first time that really that classes, races came together in a music which had a much more revolutionary, explosive impact than a lot of other forms of previous music. So that suddenly external factors, fan the flames of what was 200 people and becomes a much bigger thing. Drugs come in and impact on that. Other forms, the UK is a bizarre place in the sense that you've got the influence of, Europe, Jamaica, America, all forms of music coming into the UK, which I don't think there's anywhere in the world that you can describe a melting pot of music the same as the UK. That the whole shebeen culture in the 50s, the 60s, especially from Notting Hill to Leeds, Sheffield, all where there was a black community, that had a massive impact on how these small embryos were almost like small blues parties, which were, little illegal gatherings. But I think the fact a sense of belonging has to be the most fundamental thing to it. It has to be, when I was 16, when you were hearing house music for the first time, not in a snobbery way, but you did feel different. You felt part of something which was illicit. No one else knew about it. You dressed differently. There was a code. There wasn't necessarily, you didn't feel yourself as any bigger or better, but I think that's a fundamental thing, to have that kind of passion at the heart of it, or otherwise it just becomes just another trend that becomes assimilated into the wider thing, and Peter's awareness and become anything.
I think you've done it all now. Should we go?
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, Bill, because you've written about the sort of history of DJ and the history of music scenes, and when you would say the first music scene was that you could identify, and whether it came out of sort of gang culture or you talked about tribalism.
Probably jazz, because prior to that, you didn't it was very much about live music, and I think jazz was kind of about live music as well, but it was definitely a scene, and perhaps significantly it also happened in a period of economic depression as well, which was the case for punk, and it was also the case for acid house, and I was really banking on this current economic crisis to kind of throw up something revolutionary and interesting again, but unfortunately it hasn't really happened. But I think often times of depression are a good time for the entertainment industry, and especially for nightclubs and stuff. And jazz was certainly that. I think that was arguably the first big kind of dance explosion in terms of different dances, widespread use of cocaine, which was then legal. And use of other drugs, weed in particular, and cultish attitude towards different groups, and also the kind of otherness of like black and white people mixing together in America, which at that stage was quite an unusual thing. So I think it was definitely the first kind of big youth movement that you could say from the modern era, certainly.